When I was 14, my parents left me at my grandma's house because of my health problems. Now they're asking me for my inheritance to help my brother. When I was younger, I was diagnosed with epilepsy at a pretty early age. It was quite unfortunate because my parents were neither emotionally nor mentally equipped to handle it, and they began treating me like a diseased child they couldn't deal with. I think I was around 6 when I first noticed how differently they treated my brother and me. My brother, who was 3 years older, received far better treatment, presumably because he was much easier to deal with compared to me. As if epilepsy wasn't enough, the situation worsened when I was diagnosed with dyslexia and severe ADHD at the age of 8. Needless to say, my parents had their hands full with me. It would have been one thing if they were nice, kind people who were grateful to have a child and were up for the challenge. I know it can't be easy being a parent to a special needs child, but they were the ones who decided to have a baby. They should have been prepared for what came with it. I guess they assumed that since my brother turned out perfectly healthy, I would be too, and they didn't see this coming. Since I had already been born, my parents had no choice but to deal with me, and they made sure I felt like a burden they were merely tolerating. My childhood was far from fun and normal, not just because of my illnesses, but largely because of my parents' treatment. In fact, most of my childhood misery stemmed from their actions, not my health issues. My illnesses were a small part of it. Their response and treatment were what really upset me. They always treated me like a pariah in my own family, and I never felt included. They made sure I felt like an unwanted burden. They would walk on eggshells around me, and every time I walked into a room, they would stop talking instantly, as if my presence sucked all the life out of the room. This was how they treated me even before I was 10 years old, and it only got worse over time. My mental health became fragile, and I couldn't take it, leading to misbehavior in my teenage years. Adolescent hormones, combined with the misery of growing up in a home where I always felt unwanted, broke my heart. I began acting out, stopped putting any effort into studying, and intentionally flunked all my classes out of anger towards my parents. I was defiant, disobedient, and downright rude to everyone I knew. I pushed everyone away, even my friends, because I was so miserable and didn't know how else to get my parents to pay attention to me. Despite my behavior, they didn't seem to care much. Whenever the school summoned them because I had broken a rule or misbehaved, they would just sigh in disappointment, but wouldn't bother to reprimand me. It was incredibly frustrating, and I hated being with them. I would throw temper tantrums at home to get their attention, but they would just ignore me and talk among themselves, not even lowering their voices so I couldn't hear them. They would say things like I was having a fit again and roll their eyes, telling me to be normal. That was the most reaction I could get from them, and it was truly heartbreaking for me. When I was 14, I broke a major rule at school and decided to go all out. I brought a pack of cigarettes to school and started smoking one right in the middle of class. When my teacher demanded I stop and leave the classroom, I flipped him off. That was the last straw for me. Although I had been quite the troublemaker before, my parents had always managed to get me off the hook by telling everyone I wasn't a normal kid and wasn't right in the head. But this time there was no going back. I had expelled, and for the first time, my parents were actually furious with me. They really tore into me that day, saying things I don't think I'll ever be able to forget or forgive. It wasn't stuff I didn't already know, but hearing them say it out loud hurt deeply. They told me they regretted ever having me and that if they had known I would turn out to be such a psychotic little kid, they would have terminated the pregnancy as soon as they found out. They called me a burden on the family and said they were better off with just one son. They made it clear they were going to ensure I left the family and never came back. I was grounded for a week, and during that time, my parents literally locked me in my room. They didn't let me out except for bathroom breaks, and even my meals were sent up to me. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere or speak to anyone, and I was absolutely miserable. It felt like solitary confinement, except it was much worse because my own parents were the ones doing it to me. I didn't think I had committed a crime. I had just been acting out. In my view, it was partly on them because they never gave me the attention I needed. As a child, I needed them to be good parents, and they failed. I admit I wasn't easy to deal with due to my illnesses, but they should have considered that before deciding to have a baby. After that week of isolation, I finally understood what they meant when they said I would never be allowed back into the family again. One day, out of the blue, my parents told me to get into the car with all my stuff. My brother and mom packed my things while I waited in the car. About an hour later, everything was packed, and we started driving. The route was familiar, and soon I realized we were heading to my grandmother's place, my dad's mom. I thought they might let me stay there for a couple of weeks to straighten out, knowing my grandma was a strict disciplinarian but also had a soft spot for me. I didn't think it would be a punishment. However, once we arrived, I realized this wasn't a temporary arrangement. They were dumping me at my grandmother's house for good. They had taken that week to convince her to raise me because they were giving up on me and didn't want me around anymore. When we reached my grandmother's house, my parents unloaded all my things, left them at the door, and told me to carry them in. They said this was going to be my new home and made it clear they didn't want any contact with me ever again, especially not after what I had done. According to my parents, I had been trying my best to ruin their reputation, and now I had crossed a line I couldn't take back. As we stood at my grandmother's door, I begged them not to do this because, despite everything, I still wanted a relationship with them. I was 14, desperate for a sense of belonging in my family, and it was incredibly difficult to accept that they were abandoning me at my grandma's place. I was also worried about my grandmother's ability to care for me. She was getting old, already in her 60s, and it had taken her a week to agree to take me in. I knew she loved me, but I didn't know if she truly wanted this responsibility. I felt like I was shifting from being a burden on my parents to being a burden on my grandmother. I didn't want to disappoint her, especially since, in the past, she had always encouraged me despite being disappointed by my behavior. She would tell me she knew I was stronger than I appeared and tried to convince me that my parents would come around if I behaved better. That was another reason I didn't want to move in with her. I feared she would start resenting me just like my parents did, and I couldn't afford to lose her too. It was complicated, but I tried begging them to let me stay. They told me they had made up their minds. Right in front of me, they told my grandmother they were done with me and didn't even want to hear about me anymore. They said they didn't want a freak like me living with them and wanted to focus on my very normal brother. Hearing that really got to me because it was the same language bullies at school used to make fun of me. It hurt deeply to hear my parents use those words. It was one thing for mean kids at school to call me a freak. It didn't affect me as much because I was used to it. But hearing my parents say it made me realize they were the biggest bullies in my life. In a way, they were doing me a favor by letting me live with my grandma because they never truly loved me, no matter what I did. I bet that even if I had behaved better, they wouldn't have cared because, to them, my brother was the only child that mattered. After that, I stopped begging and accepted that I was going to live with my grandma. I decided I was going to be better because I deserved better, and so did my grandma. I resolved not to throw away my life just because my parents didn't love me. After my parents left, my grandmother and I had a much-needed conversation. She was very transparent with me, telling me that although she loved me, she hadn't been ready to take me in. She had concerns because she had heard about my behavior from my father. She explained that, at her age, it would be challenging to handle a troubled kid like me. She understood I needed help, but she wasn't sure if she could provide the right environment for me to grow up in. That's why she had taken a week to decide whether to take me in or not. But after my father told her how he had grounded me and locked me in my room for the week, she decided that her son was not the right parent to raise me. She apologized for not intervening earlier, noting that she had her own concerns to consider. As a widow with limited resources, she wasn't sure if taking me in and adopting me was the right decision. Once my grandmother saw how badly I was being treated, she could understand why I had been acting out. She told me she wanted a fresh start with me and to do right by me, unlike my parents. She suggested I see this as an opportunity, and I decided to embrace that. I apologized to her for my past behavior and forgave her for not intervening sooner or adopting me despite knowing how badly I was being treated by my parents. We agreed to leave the past behind and work together for a better future. I will always be grateful to my grandmother for everything she has done. I truly believe I wouldn't be the person I am today without her and her decision to take me in. My life turned around after that day with her support, and that's why I am where I am now. After moving in with my grandma, I made a conscious effort to improve in everything I did. She did her best to help me and create an environment where I could thrive. She found the right tutors for my academics, enrolled me in a private school, and made sure everyone understood my needs as they wouldn't treat me like every other student. Unlike my parents, my grandmother didn't use my struggles as an excuse but as a reason to provide the help I obviously needed. Her support made a significant difference, which is likely why I graduated with a good score and went to college like any other kid. I was able to pursue everything I wanted, and I owe that to my grandmother. My parents continued to visit my grandmother occasionally, but I made sure to stay out of their way. Whenever they came over, I would leave the house and only return once I was certain they had left. They didn't seem to care, and neither did I. This went on for a couple of years until my grandmother had a major confrontation with them. She told them they were terrible parents for not even attempting to talk to me, especially now that I was doing better and they had a reason to reach out and apologize for their past actions. They refused to acknowledge their mistakes and continued to pretend they were perfect parents. They called me a rotten apple and a freak once again, and my grandma lost it. She told them never to come back, and they respected her wish. Their egos were so inflated that they couldn't accept their shortcomings as parents, which led to my behavior when I was 14. Thanks to my grandmother's guidance, I had improved, but they couldn't grasp that. After that, there was no contact with them. For nearly 10 years, my grandmother and I pretended these people didn't exist in our lives. I achieved so much and hit many milestones, but I never spoke to my parents and they never reached out to me. Even though I had social media and never blocked them, they could have contacted me, they just chose not to. Only now, after my grandmother passed away a few months ago, have they reached out. It was very upsetting for me since she was the only person who truly had my back, no matter what. Even though we hadn't lived together for the past few years, since I moved out for college, graduated, and got my own place, she was still my rock and my support system. Life has been very different without her, and I was still trying to cope with her loss when I heard from my parents. Less than 6 months have passed since her death, and now they are at my door demanding that I share my inheritance with them because, apparently, my very normal and healthy brother is not doing as well as they had expected. Now they need my help to clean up the mess he made. They visited a few days ago, and my brother was not with them, which was surprising because he usually came along. I decided to interact with them, thinking they might be eager to apologize. But after some small talk and condolences, they got straight to the point. They told me that while he was in college, my brother had developed a drug habit, and it was now affecting his ability to work. I don't know why they were trying to downplay it because, from what I gathered, he was in serious trouble and needed help. Now they wanted me to share my inheritance with them whenever I came into the money so they could pay for rehab. I asked why he couldn't just attend one of the low-cost programs, which they could afford, and they said they had tried, but it wasn't good enough for him. He needed a residential program, which they claimed was expensive. I don't personally know anyone who has been to rehab, and I'm not inclined to look up the costs. All I know is that I have my own money now, thanks to a good job, and I'm comfortable. I also know that my grandmother was quite well off. My grandfather had left her a substantial amount of money, and she had invested it wisely. That's good for me but bad for my parents because, despite knowing this, they were too proud to keep in touch with her or even apologize to her towards the end, knowing they might need the money. I didn't care about any of that. I told my parents I was willing to help them with whatever amount they needed, but there was one condition: that they publicly acknowledge everything they had done in the past. The terrible way they had treated me, the things they had said, and how they had treated my grandmother were all part of what I wanted them to acknowledge. I wanted them to admit that they now needed my help and explain why they needed the money from me so that everyone would know what had transpired. For years, we had kept things private because my grandmother didn't want any drama. But now that they had the audacity to ask me to share my grandmother's money with them, despite their treatment of us over the past 10 years, I felt this was necessary. I didn't feel bad at all asking this of them. I wanted them to publicly admit everything they had done wrong. When I told them this, their faces fell. They tried to negotiate, calling me unreasonable and somewhat selfish. But I stood firm. This was my condition, and they could take it or leave it. I had no issues with providing them with the money they needed. I had no hard feelings towards my brother, and they had none towards me. But they absolutely had to acknowledge their actions for me to fully move on. They had treated me badly, and they hadn't been kind to my grandmother. This was about the money, so if they wanted her money, they had to admit what they had done. It was as simple as that. I don't understand why they are reacting this way, but when I told them my condition, they called me heartless and emotionless. They said they had never expected this from me. I told them they shouldn't have expected anything from me, considering we hadn't spoken in the past 10 years. If they wanted my help now, they would have to acknowledge and accept their mistakes and apologize for them. That's it. I don't want to hear anything more about it. They left after a lot of crying and accusations, but I didn't budge. Now they are trying to change my mind, telling me that my brother is in really bad condition and needs my help. But I don't understand why they expect me to do things for them when I never expected them to do anything for me. My grandmother and I only had each other. They never bothered to help us or even check on us. Even when my grandmother passed away, they probably wouldn't have known unless I had told my relatives. That's how they found out about the funeral and everything. So why should I help people who have had nothing to do with us for the past 10 years? I just want to be clear that I won't help them financially unless they accept and acknowledge their mistakes publicly. Update 1. Thank you for all the comments on my original post. I appreciate your concern and condolences. I am doing just fine, though dealing with the loss of my grandmother has been incredibly difficult. She lived a long, fulfilling life, and I take comfort in knowing she passed without regrets. Regarding my parents, they're still trying to contact me online, but I've made it clear that if they don't meet my conditions, they can forget about inheriting any money. I know my grandmother left everything to me in her will, and I'm sure my parents are aware, as the lawyer had sent out an email about it. Now they can only sit and wallow in their retreat. I'm not going back on my word. It has been a week since I last spoke to them, and since their usual tactics haven't worked, they've resorted to sending me photos of my brother. He looks bad and is in a pathetic condition, and they keep telling me that I should step up and help him. To that, I only have one thing to say: where were they when I needed that kind of help? They abandoned me, and I was just fortunate that my grandmother had my back. Otherwise, I don't know where I would have ended up. They didn't care about me, and as much as I feel bad for my brother, I can't help them unless they apologize for what they did. It has to be public because I want everyone to know what kind of people they really are. If they can set their egos aside just for this one thing, I guess I'll help them out because, honestly, for me, it's about shattering their pride. It was their pride that made them treat me the way they did, and now, if they really want to help the child they claim to love, they need to put that aside. So now I just want to see what comes first for them, my brother or their pride. Update 2. 10 days have passed since I last spoke to my parents. After a while, I stopped responding to their messages. They showed up at my place again a couple of hours ago, and this time, they brought my brother along with them. It was a bad scene. At the door, I told them that they couldn't do this, and their behavior was only damaging their chances of getting anything from me because I was not comfortable with them involving my brother. I could only imagine how dehumanizing it was for him to be used as a pawn. I told them to get out, and for a while, they refused to leave. They insisted that if I wanted them to go, I'd have to promise to help them soon. I made it clear that I wouldn't be making any promises and warned them that if they continued to harass me, I'd call the police. Given my brother's condition, that would not be good for them. That scared them enough to leave, but my dad muttered that both my grandmother and I were the most selfish people on the planet. That's rich coming from them, considering how they dumped me on my grandmother's doorstep because they couldn't handle a special needs kid. They didn't want to deal with me because I wasn't the perfect child they expected. If my grandmother and I are selfish, the word for what they are hasn't even been invented yet. Update 3. Hi, I kind of forgot to post here because I got really busy with work. Anyway, almost 2 months have passed since my last update, and a lot has changed. For one, I've blocked my parents and they have no way to contact me anymore because I moved into a better apartment in a new neighborhood. They don't have my new address. I've made it clear to all my relatives that they are not to give out my address to anyone, especially my parents. The last time someone decided my parents deserved to know where I live because their son was suffering, they ended up giving them my address, which is how they contacted me. But this time, I made sure that wouldn't happen again. After our last interaction, when my dad called me selfish, I decided to block them. Honestly, I didn't want any more drama. They showed me that their pride always came first, above everything else, even the son they claimed to love. I can accept that they never loved me and never wanted me because of my dyslexia, ADHD, and all my other issues. But my brother was someone they always claimed to love and thought was perfect. It was completely beyond me how they couldn't make a small sacrifice for my brother. All they had to do was admit that they had made mistakes. It wouldn't have been hard for them to do, especially since most of our family was already aware of the tensions between us. It wasn't like they were being asked to reveal something no one knew about. Yet they refused to apologize for their actions because, in their minds, they had never done anything wrong and were perfect. Well, they can cling to their delusions and I'll keep my inheritance. That seems fair enough to me.